The rain was coming down so hard it felt like standing under a waterfall, and the last thing any sane person would do is pull over for a stranger on a deserted highway. But that's exactly what he did, and it changed everything. It was the kind of downpour that turns the world into a blur of water and darkness, the kind that makes you question why you ever left the house in the first place. The windshield wipers on his beat-up 2008 Ford truck weren't clearing the rain so much as smearing it into a milky film that made the road ahead look like an oil painting left out in the storm. It was nearly midnight on a miserable Tuesday, and the heater was blowing air that was barely warmer than the rain outside, carrying the faint odor of stale fast food and the dog hair that seemed to permanently embed itself in the fabric of the seats. He'd been working since before sunrise. 12 hours hauling inventory at the warehouse, followed by a 4-hour shift sorting packages for a delivery service just to make a dent in the medical bills stacked on his kitchen counter. His eyes burned like they'd been sanded raw, and his lower back was a knot of hot, angry tension that no amount of stretching could unravel. He almost missed the car. It was a sleek, low-profile luxury sedan, charcoal grey, practically invisible against the wet asphalt and the curtains of rain hammering down. It sat at a crooked angle on the narrow shoulder of the highway, its hazard lights flickering weakly through the storm like a dying heartbeat. Caleb's foot hovered over the brake pedal. "Keep going," his exhausted brain pleaded. "Sophie's with the sitter, costing you $12 an hour just to survive. Keep driving." But then he saw the figure huddled near the rear of the car, someone clutching an umbrella that the wind was savagely trying to turn inside out, and something in his gut overrode every logical argument his tired mind could muster. He cursed under his breath, the words swallowed by the roar of the storm, and yanked the steering wheel hard to the right. The truck's tires crunched over wet gravel as he pulled onto the shoulder. He shoved the gearshift into park, zipped his worn canvas jacket up to his chin, and stepped out into the deluge. The cold hit him like a physical blow, water instantly finding its way down his collar and soaking through his jeans. As he jogged toward the stranded car, the figure flinched. It was a woman, and even through the driving rain she looked like she belonged somewhere else entirely. She wore an expensive wool coat that was being ruined in real time, the hem soaked to a dark, heavy black. Her heels were completely useless, sinking into the mud of the shoulder with every uncertain step. "Stay back," she yelled over the wind, her voice sharp as broken glass, a weapon she'd clearly used before. Her hand was inside her coat pocket, cell phone or pepper spray, he couldn't tell, and he didn't blame her for the caution. "Not looking for trouble," Caleb shouted back, stopping a few feet away, hands raised where she could see them. "Saw your hazards. You've got a flat." She hesitated, her eyes scanning him head to toe, taking in the soaked work shirt, the hair plastered to his forehead, the exhaustion etched into every line of his face. Finally, she gave a stiff nod. "Front right. I called roadside assistance an hour ago. They haven't shown up. In this weather, they're probably pulling cars out of ditches." "You have a spare." "In the trunk." "I don't know how to use the jack. It clearly cost her something to admit that." "Pop the trunk." "Get back in the car. It's freezing out here." She didn't get in the car. She stood under her failing umbrella and watched him like a hawk as he hauled the compact spare tire and the flimsy scissor jack out of the spotless trunk. The next 15 minutes were a masterclass in misery. The asphalt was a river of ice-cold water. Caleb knelt in it, his knees soaking through, his fingers going numb until they felt like blocks of wood. The lug nuts were so tight they must have been torqued by a machine. He had to stand on the pathetic little wrench, bouncing his weight on it until the metal shrieked in protest and finally gave way, sending a jolt of pain all the way up his calf. He could smell the burnt rubber of the ruined tire mixing with the sharp metallic tang of rust and rain. He grunted, forcing the jack to lift the car, pulling the shredded tire off and wrestling the heavy spare onto the bolts. Mud splattered across his cheek. He wiped it away, smearing grease across his nose in the process. When he finally lowered the car and tightened the last lug nut, he was breathing hard, his chest heaving with exertion. He tossed the ruined tire and the tools into her trunk and slammed it shut. The woman stepped closer, taking in the mud, the grease, the water dripping from his jaw. She reached into her coat and pulled out a slim leather wallet. "Thank you," she said. It sounded rehearsed. "I appreciate the intervention." She pulled out a few bills, $100 bills, 3 of them. Caleb stared at the money. He needed it. $300 was groceries for a month. It was a new winter coat for Sophie. It was a decent chunk of that dental bill that had been hanging over his head like a guillotine blade. But looking at the woman, looking at the careless, expectant way she held the cash out like she was tossing scraps to a stray dog, something hard and stubborn twisted in his gut. It wasn't pride. Pride was a luxury for people who didn't buy generic everything. It was exhaustion. He was just so tired of transactions, so tired of everything having a price tag attached to it. "Keep it," Caleb said, his voice raspy and raw. She frowned, genuine confusion breaking through her composed mask. "Excuse me, I said keep it. Put it toward a real jack. That thing in your trunk is a joke." He turned around and started walking back to his truck. "Wait." She took a step after him, her heels snapping in the mud. She stumbled, cursing under her breath. "Don't be ridiculous. Take the money." Caleb paused at his truck door, looked back at her. She wasn't holding the money like a gift. She was holding it like a shield, a barrier between her and the uncomfortable reality of needing help. "I didn't stop for a tip, lady. I stopped because you look pathetic standing out here in the mud. Go home. Drive under 50. That spare's rated for 45. He climbed into the cab, slammed the door, and put the truck in gear. As he pulled away, he glanced in the rearview mirror. She was still standing there in the rain, staring after him, those useless green bills still clutched in her hand. Caleb's apartment always smelled faintly of boiled cabbage from the neighbors down the hall and the cheap lavender cleaner he bought in bulk. He unlocked the deadbolt quietly, shed his soaked boots in the cramped entryway. The babysitter, an elderly woman from downstairs, was asleep on the lumpy sofa, a game show playing silently on the television. He tapped her shoulder, pressed 36 crumpled dollars into her hand, and watched her shuffle out the door. Then he went to Sophie's room. It was a small space, barely large enough for a twin bed and a plastic dresser, but he'd painted the walls a soft yellow and stuck glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling. Sophie was curled up under a frayed quilt, breathing deeply, her small face peaceful in sleep. Caleb stood in the doorway for a long time, just listening to the rhythm of her breathing. The ache in his back dulled slightly. The anger from the highway dissolved into the familiar heavy weight of responsibility. He didn't think about the woman on the highway. He didn't have the mental bandwidth for it. Morning came too fast, announced by the screech of a garbage truck in the alley behind the building. The routine was automatic, mechanical. Wake up. Shower in tepid water that was barely warm enough to take the chill off. Toast that got slightly burnt around the edges. Pouring the last of the milk into Sophie's cereal bowl and drinking his coffee black because there was nothing left to add to it. Walking her to the bus stop, making sure her scarf was tied tight against the cold autumn wind. By noon, Caleb was deep in the bowels of the warehouse, wrestling a pallet of copper tubing with a manual jack. The air was thick with dust and the smell of industrial grease and machine oil. Across the city, high above the streets, Vivian sat in an office that felt less like a workplace and more like an operating theater. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the skyline. The air was filtered, silent, maintained at exactly 69 degrees. Vivian did not like unresolved problems. She was the CEO of a major logistics company, a woman who had clawed her way up a deeply male-dominated corporate ladder by being colder, smarter, and more ruthless than the men who tried to block her. She understood leverage. She understood debt. What she didn't understand was the man from the highway. She sat at her glass desk, her fingers drumming a slow, impatient rhythm. Beside her keyboard lay the $300 bills, now dry and slightly wrinkled. He had looked at the money, and he had looked at her, and he had walked away with an expression of profound irritation. Not awe, not gratitude, irritation, as if she, Vivian Vanguard, were nothing more than a minor inconvenience in his night. It gnawed at her. It felt like a loose thread on a bespoke suit, something that needed to be pulled and fixed. She pressed the intercom button. David, a moment later, her head of security, stepped into the office. "Yes, ma'am." "The incident last night, the dash cam was active?" David nodded. "Always rolling, ma'am. Pull the footage. Get me the license plate. Run it. I want a name, an address, and an occupation. I want to know who he is." David raised an eyebrow, but knew better than to ask why. "Give me an hour. It took 45 minutes. When the file landed on her tablet, Vivian scrolled through it with clinical detachment. Caleb Miller, 32. Widowed. One dependent, a daughter age 6. No criminal record. Credit score hovering in the low 500s. 2 maxed-out credit cards employed at a supply company. She stared at the screen. The man was drowning. The math of his life was a slow-motion financial disaster, and yet he had refused her money. He had called her pathetic and told her to buy a better Jack. It made no sense. People without money obsessed over money. They compromised for it. They begged for it. Vivian stood up and walked to the glass, looking down at the crawling traffic below. She realized with a faint twist of discomfort that she felt indebted. And Vivian Vanguard did not owe debts to anyone. She walked back to her desk, opened a heavy mahogany drawer, and pulled out her personal checkbook. She didn't put on her coat. She buzzed her assistant. "Clear my afternoon. Have the car brought around." The gravel lot behind the supply warehouse was a landscape of broken pallets, rusted dumpsters, and muddy puddles slick with rainbow-colored oil slicks. When the black, luxury SUV rolled onto the lot, it was like a spaceship landing in a junkyard. Caleb was on his lunch break. He was sitting on an overturned milk crate near the loading dock, eating a cold turkey sandwich wrapped in aluminum foil. His hands were black with soot, his knuckles scraped raw. He chewed slowly, staring at the grey sky, calculating how much overtime he'd need to pull to fix the blown head gasket on his truck. The heavy door of the SUV opened. Vivian stepped out. She'd traded the ruined trench coat for a sharp, tailored blazer over a silk blouse, but she still looked completely alien in this environment. The air out here smelled of diesel and wet cardboard. She navigated the uneven gravel carefully, her eyes locking onto Caleb. Caleb stopped chewing. He watched her approach, feeling a spike of pure annoyance. Oh, great. The highway princess? He didn't stand up. He swallowed the dry bite of sandwich and wiped his mouth with the back of his wrist. "You're a hard man to find," Vivian said, stopping a few feet away. She didn't sound breathless. She sounded entirely in control. "I'm at work," Caleb said flatly. "Usually where people with jobs are." She ignored the jab. Her eyes swept over his dirty boots, the frayed cuffs of his jacket, the half-eaten sandwich. It wasn't disgust, but calculation. "Your name is Caleb Miller." Caleb's jaw tightened. "How do you know my name? How did you find me? License plates are public record if you have the right people looking. That's illegal. It's an administrative gray area. Look, I don't like owing people. And I don't like being dismissed. I didn't dismiss you," Caleb said, leaning forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "I fixed your tire. You went your way. I went mine. That's how the world works. There's no debt. I decide when a debt is cleared," she countered, her voice dropping. She reached into her blazer pocket. "I did a background check on you. Nothing intrusive. Public records. You're barely keeping your head above water. You have a daughter. You have debts." Caleb stood up. He wasn't a tall man, but the sudden movement, fueled by a sudden intense anger, made Vivian take a half-step back. The security guard by the SUV tensed. "You ran a background check on me." His voice was dangerously quiet. "You think because you drive a fancy car you get to dig through my life." "I think," Vivian said, standing her ground, "that you are letting foolish pride get in the way of common sense." She pulled a pale blue slip of paper from her pocket. A check. She held it out to him. "I signed it. The amount is blank. Fill in whatever number clears your debts. Pay off your truck. Put away something for your daughter's college. Consider it an exorbitant roadside assistance fee." Caleb looked at the small piece of paper fluttering in the wind. A blank check from a billionaire. In the movies, this was the moment the poor man broke down in grateful tears. This was the moment the music swelled, and he grabbed the paper like a lifeline. But Caleb felt absolutely nothing but insult. He didn't look at the check. He looked at her. He saw the tension in her jaw, the the way she held the paper slightly too high. She wasn't doing this to help him. She was doing this to cure her own discomfort. She was buying her way out of an emotion she didn't want to feel. "You think this is a favor?" Caleb asked softly. "It's a solution." "For who?" Caleb let out a dry, humorless laugh. He wiped his greasy hands on a rag hanging from his belt. "You think I want your guilt money? You think I'm going to take a handout from some stranger who stalks my kids' public records because her ego got bruised in a rainstorm?" "It's a blank check," Vivian said, her voice finally cracking, a sliver of genuine frustration bleeding through. "Don't be an idiot. Take it." "No." Caleb stepped closer. He didn't touch her, didn't touch the check, but his proximity forced her to look him directly in the eyes. "My life is messy. I'm broke. I'm tired. But it's mine. I don't owe anyone, and nobody owns me. Least of all someone who thinks a piece of paper fixes everything." He turned his back on her and walked toward the loading dock stairs. "Hey!" Vivian shouted. It was the loudest he'd heard her. She sounded genuinely angry now. "You can't just walk away from this." Caleb didn't stop. He pushed open the heavy metal door of the warehouse. "Buy a better jack, lady," he called over his shoulder, and the door slammed shut behind him. Vivian stood in the gravel lot, the wind whipping her hair around her face, holding a blank check that felt heavier than a block of lead. She had offered a desperate man a new life, and he had spat in her face. She lowered the check, folding it carefully, precisely, into perfect squares. She slid it back into her pocket. The security guard was watching her warily. "Back to the office, ma'am?" Vivian looked at the closed metal door of the warehouse. Her heart was beating uncharacteristically fast. "No," she said softly. "Find out who owns this supply company." 3 weeks. That was exactly how long it took for the invisible machinery of limitless capital to reach the rusted loading docks of Apex Industrial Supply. It started with the coffee. Caleb walked into the break room one Tuesday, expecting the bitter, burnt sludge the old vending machine dispensed. Instead, he found a gleaming stainless steel commercial espresso machine. Next to it were bags of whole beans that smelled like dark chocolate and roasted hazelnuts. "Oh, corporate sent it?" muttered a forklift driver who'd been at Apex for a decade, staring at the machine with deep suspicion. "They bought us out over the weekend? Check the bulletin board." Caleb turned. Pinned beneath a layer of yellowed safety notices was a crisp, heavy stock memorandum. The letterhead was stark. Minimalist black text, Vanguard Supply Solutions, a subsidiary of Vanguard Logistics. A cold, heavy knot formed at the base of Caleb's throat. Over the next 4 days, the warehouse transformed. The gritty, lived-in chaos of Apex was systematically sterilized. Men in tailored suits with clipboards swarmed the aisles, counting inventory with laser scanners. The old, flickering fluorescent tubes were replaced with glaring lead panels that exposed every grease stain on the concrete floor. The fraying uniforms were swapped for stiff, dark blue canvas shirts bearing the Vanguard logo. The fabric chafed against Caleb's neck like a collar. Then came Friday, payday. Caleb was sitting on the edge of the bathtub in his cramped bathroom, the only room in the apartment with a door that locked, staring at the cracked screen of his phone. The bathroom smelled of bleach and the mildew he could never quite scrub out of the grout. He opened his banking app. The screen loaded. Caleb stopped breathing. His usual bi-weekly direct deposit hovered around $800 after taxes. Today's deposit was for $4,250.75. He stared at the pixels until they blurred. There was a separate line item beneath his standard hourly wage: retroactive hazard and market adjustment compensation. It was enough to pay off the suffocating dental bill. It was enough for the head gasket on the Ford. It was enough for a month of groceries that didn't involve powdered cheese or canned soup. It was exactly, down to the dollar, what he needed to stop drowning. And Caleb hated it. The anger didn't explode. It seeped into his bloodstream like ice water. He walked out of the bathroom. Sophie was sitting on the rug in the living room, brushing the tangled hair of a plastic doll. She looked up at him, her eyes wide and innocent, utterly oblivious to the economic war being waged over her father's head. "You okay, Daddy?" she asked. "Yeah, Bug," Caleb said, his voice hollow, synthetic. "I'm fine." He wasn't fine. He felt a profound, sickening sense of violation. This wasn't a bonus. This wasn't corporate restructuring. This was Vivian. She hadn't been able to force a piece of paper into his hand in a muddy parking lot, so she had simply bought the ground he stood on and wired the money directly into his veins. He went to work on Monday, carrying a physical weight in his chest. He marched past the time clock, past the shiny new espresso machine, and kicked open the door to the manager's office. The old manager, a grizzled guy who smelled of stale cigars, was gone. Then his place, in a slim-fit button-down, tapping on an iPad. The office smelled of expensive cologne and whiteboard markers. "Can I help you?" the new manager asked, blinking up at Caleb. "I want to see the market adjustment metrics," Caleb demanded, his voice low, vibrating with suppressed fury. "For the warehouse floor." The manager offered a practiced, placating smile. "I'm sorry, Mr. Miller. Those algorithms are proprietary Vanguard HR data. Rest assured, your compensation package was personally reviewed and approved by top management." "Who else got it?" Caleb interrupted, stepping closer to the desk. "Louise? Hector? Did the guys in receiving get a $3,000 bump for retroactive hazards?" The manager's smile tightened. A bead of sweat appeared at his hairline. "Compensation is strictly confidential. I cannot discuss other employees. Nobody else got it." Caleb said it wasn't a question. He turned around and walked out. The warehouse felt different now. It didn't feel like a place of labor anymore. It felt like a terrarium. He was a bug in a jar, and Vivian Vanguard was tapping on the glass. During his lunch break, Caleb sat in the cab of his truck. The engine was off. The rain had returned, a cold, persistent drizzle tapping against the windshield. He looked at the dashboard. He could take the money to the mechanic tomorrow. He could fix the heat. He could drive Sophie to school without making her wear 3 layers of fleece. The internal contradiction tore at him, sharp and brutal. His body, exhausted and broken by years of grinding poverty, screamed at him to shut up and take the cash. "Don't be stupid," his aching spine whispered. Pride doesn't pay the heating bill. But deeper down, a voice he trusted more than his own exhaustion knew the truth. Wealth like Vivian's wasn't charity. It was a gravity well. It pulled you in, stripped you of your autonomy, and made you dependent. If he kept this money, he was acknowledging that he had a price. He was accepting that his life, his struggles, and his dignity were just commodities she could purchase to soothe her bruised ego. Caleb started the engine. It sputtered, choked, and finally roared to life, the fan belts squealing in protest. He gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. "No," he whispered to the empty cab. He put the truck in gear and drove out of the lot. He didn't go back to work. He went to his bank. The teller, a tired woman with smudged glasses, looked at him strangely as he requested the cashier's check. "That's a significant withdrawal, sir. It will trigger a fee of $15, she warned him. $15. 2 hours of babysitting, a week of gas. Do it?" The metallic taste of adrenaline coated his tongue. He watched the printer spit out the heavy watermarked paper. It was made out for exactly $3,438.75, the exact amount of the hazard bonus. He folded it carefully, mirroring the precise, aggressive way Vivian had folded her blank check, and shoved it into his jacket pocket. The Vanguard logistics tower pierced the low-hanging gray clouds like a glass syringe. Caleb parked his battered Ford between a matte black luxury car and a pristine SUV in the visitor's lot. The juxtaposition was almost comical. He stepped out, his steel-toed boots hitting the immaculately swept pavement. The lobby of the building was a monument to enforced silence. The walls were clad in slabs of gray marble that looked cold enough to preserve meat. The ceiling was impossibly high, making the people walking across the floor look small and insignificant. The air smelled of ozone, filtered oxygen, and the faint, sharp scent of wealth. Caleb walked to the security desk. He didn't belong here, and every cell in his body knew it. His canvas jacket was frayed at the cuffs. There was grease permanently embedded in the creases of his palms. The security guard, a massive man in a tailored suit, stood up as Caleb approached. It was David, the same guard from the gravel lot. His eyes narrowed slightly, assessing the threat. "Mr. Miller, you're a long way from the warehouse." "Tell her I'm here," Caleb said, his voice flat, devoid of intimidation but heavy with absolute resolve. "Miss Vanguard doesn't take unannounced walk-ins. If you have a grievance regarding the acquisition, there is an HR portal." "I'm not here about HR." Caleb reached into his pocket and pulled out the folded cashier's check. He held it out. "I'm here to return a tip. Give it to her. Tell her the guy with the jack doesn't like being bought." David looked at the folded paper. He didn't take it. Instead, he touched his earpiece, listening to a voice on a frequency Caleb couldn't hear. The guard's expression shifted, a flicker of surprise breaking through his stoic mask. "Elevator Bank B, floor 42. She's expecting you." Caleb bypassed the guard. The elevator ride was a high-speed, ear-popping ascent in a silent steel box. When the doors slid open, Caleb stepped onto a floor that was entirely open concept, bounded by floor-to-ceiling glass that offered a dizzying view of the city's concrete grid. Vivian was standing by the window. She wore a dark crimson dress, impeccably structured. She looked out over the skyline, a general surveying conquered territory. As Caleb's heavy boots squeaked against the polished hardwood floor, she turned. Her face was a mask of cool, practiced detachment, but he saw the slight tightening of the muscles around her eyes. "Caleb," she said. The acoustics of the massive room made her voice sound isolated, lonely. "I see you received your updated compensation package." Caleb didn't stop walking until he was a few feet from her expansive glass desk. He took the cashier's check and dropped it onto the pristine surface. It landed with a soft, dismissive tap. $3,438.75, Caleb said. Vivian looked at the check. She didn't touch it. "I don't understand. The hazard pay is fully documented. It's taxed. It's legal. It's a bribe." Caleb's voice was rough against the sterile silence of the room. "And it's a cage. You bought a $10 million supply company just so you could force money into my bank account without me being able to say no. Vanguard Logistics is aggressively expanding its supply chain infrastructure," Vivian recited smoothly, though her pulse was visibly jumping at her throat. Apex Industrial was undervalued. It was a sound business acquisition. Your financial adjustment was merely a byproduct of bringing legacy employees up to corporate standards. "Bull." The word cracked like a whip in the quiet room. Vivian flinched. No one spoke to her like that. No one in this building had ever spoken to her like that. Caleb leaned forward, placing his calloused hands flat on her glass desk. "Nobody else on the floor got a dime." "Vivian," I asked, "you didn't optimize a supply chain. You didn't op-ground check, found out exactly what it would take to pull me out of debt, and you wired it to me. You couldn't handle the fact that someone in this world didn't want what you were selling." Vivian's posture finally broke. She slammed a hand onto the desk, her manicured nails clicking against the glass. "I was trying to help you," she snapped, her voice rising, fracturing the carefully maintained temperature of the room. "I saw your life. I saw the math. You are one broken bone, one hospital visit away from losing everything. From losing your daughter. I offered you a lifeline, and you threw it back because of some archaic, pathetic sense of male pride." "It's not pride," Caleb roared back. The anger finally spilled over. He stepped around the desk, invading her immaculate, perfectly curated space. She didn't back away. "It's survival," Caleb hissed, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. He was close enough now to smell her perfume, something sharp, chemical, like flowers grown in a sterile lab. "You think money fixes the world because it's the only tool you have. But if I take your money, I take your pity. I become a line item on your balance sheet. I become a problem you solved." He looked around the massive empty office. It was beautiful, flawless, and completely devoid of warmth. "Look at this place. You have everything, but you were perfectly willing to upend my entire life, commodify my job, and invade my privacy just so you wouldn't have to feel uncomfortable about a guy fixing your tire in the rain. You didn't do this for me, Vivian. You did this to absolve yourself." Vivian stared at him. Her breathing was shallow. For the first time, the billionaire CEO looked stripped bare. The defensive corporate jargon had evaporated. "You refused my help," she whispered, her voice shaking slightly. "You made me feel indebted." "I made you feel human," Caleb corrected gently. The anger was draining out of him now, replaced by a profound exhaustion. "And you hated it," he looked at her for a long moment. He saw the tension in her shoulders, the deep, hidden exhaustion in her eyes that mirrored his own. They were both tired, just fighting on different fronts. "Keep the company," Caleb said, stepping back, putting the heavy glass desk between them again. "Keep the LED lights and the expensive coffee, but leave my paycheck alone. Pay me what I earn, nothing more, nothing less. And if I refuse, then I quit. And you'll have bought a warehouse for nothing." He turned and walked toward the elevators. The heavy, squeaking sound of his boots echoed off the marble walls, fading as the elevator doors slid shut, sealing him away. Vivian stood alone in her massive office. The silence rushed back in, heavier than before. She looked down at the glass desk. The cashier's check sat there, perfectly folded, a physical manifestation of a boundary she couldn't buy her way across. Slowly, with a trembling hand, she picked it up. She walked over to the heavy mahogany drawer, the same drawer where she kept her personal checkbook. She opened it, placed Caleb's check inside, and closed it with a soft final click. She turned back to the window, looking out at the city below. The cars were tiny, crawling through the concrete canyons. She had always felt above it all, untouchable. But as she stood there, the air conditioning blowing coldly against her skin, Vivian realized something terrifying. The debt hadn't been cleared. The anomaly remained. For the first time in her life, she had encountered something she couldn't afford. 2 hours later, Caleb's truck rattled to a stop in the gravel lot of his apartment building. The engine coughed twice before dying. He climbed the 3 flights of stairs, his knees aching with every step. The hallway smelled of boiled cabbage and old laundry. It was the smell of struggle. It was the smell of home. He unlocked his door. The TV was murmuring softly in the background. Mrs. Gable was dozing on the couch. Caleb walked into the tiny kitchen. He opened the pantry, scanning the meager shelves. He pulled out a blue box of macaroni and cheese. He filled a pot with water and set it on the stove, watching the blue flames flicker to life. Sophie padded into the kitchen, wearing slightly oversized socks, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "Mac and cheese?" she asked, her voice raspy. Caleb looked at her. He thought of the thousands of dollars he had just walked away from. He thought of the cold, perfect silence of Vivian's office. Then he looked at his daughter, standing on the scuffed linoleum, bathed in the warm yellow light of the kitchen. He smiled. It was a small, exhausted smile, but it was real. "Yeah, Bug," Caleb said, reaching out to ruffle her hair. "The good stuff." The water began to boil, a low, comforting rumble in the small apartment. Caleb poured the pasta in, the cheap noodles rattling against the metal pot. He was still broke. He was still tired. The truck still needed a new gasket, and the winter wind would still rattle their thin windows, but the air in the room was his own. He inhaled deeply, smelling the powdery artificial cheese, and felt an anchor drop deep into his chest. He was standing on solid ground, and no one, not even a billionaire with a blank check, could buy it out from under him. Wealth can buy almost anything, but it can't buy sovereignty. Caleb chose the brutal reality of his struggle over a gilded cage, leaving Vivian to realize that some human dignity simply cannot be optimized or purchased. So here's my question for you. Would you have taken the money? Would you have protected your pride? Or would you have done what Caleb did and drawn a line in the sand that no amount of cash could cross? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story struck a chord, if it made you think about the price of dignity and the things money can't buy, hit that like button, subscribe to my channel for more raw, grounded storytelling, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Because some things are worth more than money, and some lines, once crossed, can never be uncrossed.